A billionaire CEO's life shatters when a 5-year-old girl walks into his office, calls him "daddy," and collapses in his arms, unaware she's about to expose the past he spent his life running from. The city stretched beneath him like a sea of glass and steel, endless and indifferent. From the top floor of Reed Enterprises, Ethan Reed could see everything: streets pulsing with light, cars like veins of silver, people reduced to movement. He liked it that way. He liked control. Every detail of his life had been engineered for precision, every success a calculated result of effort and intelligence. People called him a genius, a self-made billionaire, a visionary. But none of them knew that his nights were silent and empty, that he sometimes stayed in his office until sunrise, not because of work, but because going home meant facing nothing at all. He had traded warmth for power long ago, and he thought he'd made peace with it. That illusion shattered the moment the doors to his office burst open. He looked up, ready to scold whoever dared interrupt him. The words froze on his tongue when he saw her, a small girl, no older than 5, standing in the doorway. Her blonde hair was tangled, her pink dress torn at the hem, and her wide blue eyes looked too bright, too desperate. The receptionist was nowhere behind her. For a moment, she just stood there, her tiny chest rising and falling with rapid breaths, and then she whispered, her voice trembling but clear enough to slice through the silence, "I found you, Daddy." The pen in Ethan's hand slipped and hit the floor. For a second, he thought he'd misheard her. His mind couldn't process the words. "What did you say?" he asked, his tone quieter than he intended, almost fragile. The girl took a step forward, her shoes scraping softly against the marble. "I found you," she repeated, her gaze fixed on him. "Mommy said you'd be here. She said you have kind eyes." Her lips trembled, and before he could stand, her knees buckled. Ethan was out of his chair in a heartbeat, catching her before she hit the floor. Her body was frighteningly light, as if she hadn't eaten in days. Her skin was warm with fever, her breathing shallow. "Call emergency services," he ordered into the intercom, his voice sharp again, though his heart was pounding hard enough to hurt. He carried her to the couch, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. The smallness of her hand against his suit sleeve felt unreal. He didn't know her. He was certain he didn't. And yet, something deep in his chest twisted painfully, as if recognizing her anyway. By the time the paramedics arrived, his office had turned into chaos. His assistant stammered questions he didn't answer. The girl had lost consciousness, her head resting limply against his shoulder. He followed the medics to the elevator, ignoring the stares from employees who had never seen him leave his office without a purpose. He sat in the ambulance beside her, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest, the faint twitch of her fingers, and felt a strange fear he hadn't known in years, the fear of losing something before he even understood what it was. At the hospital, they told him her name was Lily. She had no identification, no guardian waiting for her, only a small backpack with a few worn clothes and a faded photo of a woman with gentle eyes and golden hair. The nurse said the woman in the picture had died months ago. They believed Lily had escaped from a foster home on the outskirts of the city. But none of that explained why she had come to him. When Lily woke up later that night, her small voice filled the sterile white room like the softest echo. "Are you still here?" she asked, turning her head toward him. He was sitting by her bed, his jacket folded over the chair, his tie loosened. For reasons he couldn't explain, he hadn't left. "Yes," he said. "You fainted. The doctors say you'll be fine." She smiled faintly. "I knew you'd stay." He frowned, unsure how to respond. "Lily, I'm not your father," he said carefully. "I think you're confused." She shook her head weakly, her eyes glassy but certain. "No. Mommy said when I find the man with blue eyes like mine, I'll find my daddy." He looked away, swallowing hard. Her logic was childish, innocent, but something about it disarmed him completely. He had spent his entire life surrounded by people who wanted things from him, money, power, opportunities, but this small girl wanted nothing but recognition, a simple truth that he couldn't give. He stood up, meaning to leave, but her voice stopped him again. "You have the same eyes," she murmured, already drifting back to sleep. That night, back in his empty apartment, Ethan couldn't close his eyes. He kept seeing her, those blue eyes, so much like his own, that tiny hand gripping the edge of his sleeve before she fell unconscious. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, then another, but the warmth of it only made the cold inside him sharper. He thought about the woman in the photo, about the way Lily had said her mother's name. Emma. It struck him like lightning. He hadn't heard that name in over 6 years. Suddenly, the walls he'd built around himself started to crumble. Emma, the one woman who had loved him when he had nothing, when he was just a man with dreams too big and a heart too afraid. He had left her because he wanted success more than stability. And now, a child with her face and his eyes had walked into his life, calling him father. Ethan stared out the window at the glittering skyline that had once symbolized everything he'd achieved. But for the first time, it didn't look like triumph. It looked like punishment. Somewhere between the glass towers and the shadows, his past had found him. And this time, it wasn't a business rival or an old regret, it was a 5-year-old girl who believed in him more than he ever had in himself. He didn't know it yet, but that single moment, the sound of her small voice saying, "I found you, Daddy," would change everything he thought he knew about himself, about love, and about what it truly meant to be alive. The next morning, Ethan arrived at the hospital earlier than he intended. He had told himself it was only to sign the paperwork, to make sure the girl was being properly cared for before the authorities took over, but he knew that was a lie. He barely slept that night, his thoughts circling endlessly around her voice, the photograph, the name Emma. Now, as he stepped into the quiet corridor that smelled faintly of antiseptic and morning coffee, he felt an unfamiliar heaviness in his chest. His entire career had been built on avoiding emotional distractions, on cutting away anything that threatened to make him vulnerable. And yet here he was, drawn to a fragile little girl he didn't know, whose presence somehow reached into the deepest part of his carefully guarded heart. When he entered her room, Lily was awake. She was sitting up in bed, her small legs swinging off the edge, eating cereal from a plastic bowl. The sunlight filtered through the blinds, catching her hair and turning it to gold. She looked up as soon as he walked in and smiled, the kind of smile that could melt through the coldest silence. "You came back," she said simply, as if she had never doubted it. He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Of course. How are you feeling?" She shrugged and kept eating. "Better. The nurse said I can go home soon." He didn't know how to respond. Home. The word hung between them, painfully empty. "Do you know where home is, Lily?" he asked gently. She thought for a moment, then pointed to the window. "Mommy said home is where people love you. So, maybe here." Her innocence hit him like a punch to the gut. There was no manipulation, no expectation, just pure belief. He had spent his whole life surrounded by people who smiled when they needed something. This child didn't want anything but connection. A social worker entered the room, clipboard in hand, interrupting the moment. She introduced herself, explaining that Lily would be transferred back to the foster system once discharged. "She's been through a lot," the woman said, glancing at Ethan's expensive suit with polite suspicion. "Are you a relative?" He opened his mouth, ready to deny it, but the words caught. "No," he said finally. "Just someone she found." The social worker frowned slightly, her pen tapping the clipboard. "Then I'm afraid we'll need to keep this interaction brief. We don't want her to get attached." Lily's spoon clattered against the bowl. I already am, she said, her voice small but defiant. The woman sighed, muttered something about procedures, and left the room, leaving behind an uncomfortable silence. When the door closed, Lily looked at him, her eyes suddenly wet. Are they taking me away again? She asked. Ethan knelt beside her bed. No one's taking you anywhere today, he said. It wasn't a promise he had the right to make, but it was the only thing he could think to say. Her small hand reached out and rested on his. You're not like the others, she whispered. The others don't look sad when they smile. He didn't know what to say to that. He had spent years perfecting the art of the controlled smile, the kind that looked warm but meant nothing. Somehow, she had seen through it in a day. After a long pause, she spoke again. Can I tell you a secret? He nodded, unsure what else to do. Mommy told me about you before she got sick. She said you were smart and strong but didn't know how to be happy. She said I should find you when she was gone because you needed someone to remind you how. Her words, so soft and certain, felt like a key turning in a locked door inside him. He stared at her, speechless. Could Emma have known she was dying? Could she really have told her daughter to find him, after all those years? The idea seemed impossible, and yet, the way Lily spoke, the absolute conviction in her voice, made him believe. He stayed with her the rest of the morning, listening to her stories. She told him about the foster homes, about the kind lady who let her sleep with a nightlight, and the not-so-kind one who took it away. She spoke about her mother's paintings, bright, messy splashes of color that filled the walls of their old apartment. Mommy said colors make people feel alive, Lily said. But after she got sick, everything looked gray. Ethan had no words. He had built his world in shades of gray, steel buildings, monochrome suits, black-tinted cars, and hearing this small girl speak of color made him realize how long it had been since he'd seen anything vibrant. When the doctor came in to check on her, Ethan stepped outside. He stood by the window in the hallway, staring down at the city below. He had always loved this view, the order of it, the control, but now it just felt hollow. He thought about Emma. About the last time he had seen her, her voice shaking as she told him she was pregnant, and his own voice, colder than he remembered, telling her he wasn't ready. He had thought he was doing the right thing, cutting ties cleanly so she could move on. But she hadn't. And now, years later, her daughter was sitting in a hospital bed, looking at him with her mother's eyes, asking to stay. When he returned to the room, Lily was holding something, a crumpled piece of paper the nurse had given her. It was a drawing she'd made with crayons, a simple picture of a man with brown hair and blue eyes holding hands with a little girl in a pink dress. Above them, written in uneven letters, were the words, "Me and Daddy." She handed it to him shyly. "Do you like it?" she asked. He couldn't speak. He could only nod. "I'll make another one tomorrow," she said cheerfully. "With Mommy in the sky, watching us." He folded the drawing carefully and put it in his pocket, his throat too tight to form words. That evening, when the social worker came back with papers to sign, he stopped her at the door. "What if I took responsibility for her?" he asked. The woman blinked in surprise. "Mr. Reed, that's not a simple process. You'd have to go through background checks, home visits, interviews," he interrupted her, his voice steady. "Then start them." She studied him for a long moment, perhaps sensing that this wasn't a whim. "You're serious," she said finally. "Why?" He looked through the window at Lily, who was now sleeping peacefully, her small hand clutching the corner of his jacket like a lifeline. "Because," he said quietly, "she found me for a reason. And I'm not going to lose her again." When he walked out of the hospital that night, the city lights no longer looked cold. They shimmered with a strange new warmth, a reminder that even in the middle of his carefully constructed empire, something real had found its way in, a small, fragile hand that had reached through years of silence and pulled him back into life. He didn't know what was coming next, but for the first time in a decade, he didn't want to control it. He just wanted to see where it would lead. When Lily was discharged from the hospital, the air between her and Ethan felt both fragile and strangely inevitable. The social worker had arranged temporary foster care, but Ethan had already begun the process of applying for guardianship, something he never imagined himself doing. Paperwork, background checks, interviews, all of it was foreign to him, a man who usually let his lawyers and assistants handle such details. Yet this time, he insisted on being involved. He wanted to be the one signing, explaining, waiting. It was the first decision in years that didn't come from logic but from something deeper, something dangerously close to the heart. He couldn't explain to anyone why this mattered so much, he only knew that if he let Lily slip away now, he'd lose the only real thing left in his life. The first few days were chaos. Lily was placed in a foster home temporarily while the court processed Ethan's petition. He visited her every evening, bringing her books, art supplies, and stories from a life she couldn't yet understand. At first, she was shy, her smile small and uncertain, as if afraid he might disappear like everyone else had. But gradually, she began to open up, showing him drawings of the two of them together, each one more detailed than the last. In one picture, they were sitting under a tree, in another, they were holding hands outside a tall building that looked suspiciously like his office tower. When he asked why she drew that, she said, "Because that's where I found you. That's where my story started." He didn't tell her that his story had started falling apart the moment she stepped through those office doors. He didn't tell her that since she appeared, he'd been unable to focus on anything else, not the company, not the meetings, not the investors who were already whispering that their brilliant CEO had gone soft. He didn't care. For the first time, he felt something stronger than ambition, the ache of wanting to make things right. One evening, after dropping Lily back with her foster guardian, Ethan went home to his penthouse. The city stretched out in every direction, dazzling and cold. He poured himself a drink, but the glass trembled in his hand before he set it down. On the table lay the DNA results, the photo of Emma, and the crayon drawing Lily had given him in the hospital. He stared at them for a long time before picking up the phone and calling the lawyer who had once handled Emma's trust case. The man hesitated before speaking. "I didn't think I'd ever hear from you again, Mr. Reed." Ethan's voice was low. "Tell me everything you know about Emma Harper's last years." What he learned that night left him hollow. After their breakup, Emma had struggled to stay afloat, painting for small galleries, working part-time to support herself and her unborn child. She never reached out to him again, not once. Then, 5 years ago, she was diagnosed with a rare illness. Her condition worsened quickly, and when her medical bills became too much, she sold her artwork, one piece at a time. Eventually, she had to move into a small government-assisted apartment. The lawyer's voice cracked slightly as he said, "She never took a dime from your settlement, even though she could have. She said she didn't want her daughter growing up believing money could replace love." After the call ended, Ethan sat in the dark for a long time, the weight of silence pressing against him. The image of Emma alone in some dim apartment, painting until her hands failed her, haunted him. He realized that the woman he'd once loved hadn't abandoned him, he had abandoned her. And now, her daughter had found him, carrying the same eyes, the same stubborn heart, as if fate refused to let him run any longer. The following week, he met with the social worker to discuss Lily's case. The woman's tone was cautious but professional. "Mr. Reed, we've reviewed your file. Your background is impressive, but this is highly unusual. It's rare for someone in your position to take on full custody." He looked her in the eye, his expression unreadable. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe no one ever does what's unusual until it matters. The woman hesitated, then nodded. You'll need to pass a home inspection and psychological evaluation. We also require proof that you can provide emotional stability. The irony wasn't lost on him, a billionaire questioned for his ability to love. Days turned into weeks. The process dragged on, but Ethan didn't waver. He began transforming his penthouse, hiring an interior designer not to impress, but to make it livable for a child. He replaced sleek glass furniture with softer tones, added warmth to rooms that had once been lifeless. In the guest bedroom, he painted one wall pale pink himself, his strokes uneven but careful. When his assistant walked in and saw him covered in paint, she froze. "Sir, I didn't know you," he cut her off gently. "Neither did I." Finally, after a month of waiting, the court granted him temporary guardianship. When he arrived at the foster home to take Lily with him, she ran into his arms without hesitation. "I knew you'd come," she whispered against his shoulder. He carried her to the car, and for a brief moment, everything in his world felt aligned. That night, as she explored his penthouse, her small footsteps echoed through the marble floors. She stopped in the living room, staring out at the city lights. "Do you live in the sky?" she asked, awed. He smiled faintly. "Something like that." She turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "It's pretty, but lonely." He didn't answer. She didn't need him to. Later, when he tucked her into bed for the first time, she looked up at him sleepily. "Mommy said you were good inside, just hiding it." She was right. He brushed a strand of hair from her forehead, his throat tight. "You should sleep, Lily." Her eyes fluttered closed, and within minutes, she was breathing softly. He sat beside her for a long while, watching her chest rise and fall, realizing that the emptiness he had carried for years had begun to fade. Outside the window, the city glittered as it always had, but something had shifted. Ethan no longer saw it as his empire. He saw it as a cage he had built for himself, one that a 5-year-old girl had unknowingly shattered just by walking into his life. He didn't know what kind of father he would be, or whether he even deserved to try, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty: he would never walk away again. The first weeks of Lily living with Ethan were filled with quiet adjustments and small discoveries that felt strangely significant. The penthouse, once a place of silence and efficiency, began to fill with sound, the soft padding of small feet, the rustle of pages as Lily read picture books, the occasional burst of laughter that echoed down the marble hallways like something wild and new. Ethan found himself waking earlier, not to check emails or financial reports, but because he heard her humming to herself in the kitchen as she tried to pour milk into her cereal without spilling it. He had spent years existing in routine, meetings, numbers, profits, but this was the first time in a long time that his mornings felt unpredictable in a way that made him feel alive. Still, beneath the surface of this fragile calm, something restless stirred. He had spent his life mastering control, but fatherhood, or whatever version of it he was learning, was the opposite of control. Lily asked questions he didn't know how to answer, about everything from why clouds moved to whether her mother could see them from heaven. When he hesitated, she would simply nod and say, "It's okay, you don't have to know everything," which somehow made him feel both comforted and exposed. He had faced billion-dollar negotiations with perfect composure, yet the sight of her small hand reaching for his during a thunderstorm left him wordless. He didn't know how to comfort a child, all he could do was hold her close until she stopped trembling, pretending it was for her sake and not his own. One evening, after he tucked her into bed, he walked into his study and opened the folder that contained the last remnants of Emma's life. There were hospital bills, letters from social services, a few sketches signed in her looping handwriting. Among them was a letter addressed to him, unopened, dated 5 years ago. His hands shook as he broke the seal. The words inside were short but devastating. She had written to tell him she was sick, not to ask for help, but to let him know that their daughter existed. "I don't want anything from you," she had written, "but if you ever decide to stop running, she deserves to know you." He read the letter 3 times before setting it down, staring at the ink until it blurred. He had been too busy building an empire to read the one message that could have saved him years of regret. In the days that followed, guilt clung to him like a shadow. He became quieter, distracted during meals, staring at his untouched coffee while Lily talked about school or the new books she wanted. One morning, she stopped mid-sentence and looked at him curiously. "You look sad," she said. "Did I do something wrong?" He reached across the table, his voice rough. "No, Lily. You didn't do anything wrong. I just made a lot of mistakes before I met you." She tilted her head thoughtfully. "Mommy said everyone makes mistakes, but if they fix them, they turn into good people again." The simplicity of her belief broke something inside him. He smiled faintly. "Then I guess I'm still learning how to fix them." She grinned. "That's okay. I can help." His transformation didn't go unnoticed. The media, always hungry for stories, began to speculate about the sudden change in his lifestyle. Reporters questioned why the city's most powerful CEO had vanished from public events, why his company's expansion projects were stalling. Investors whispered that something, or someone, had distracted him. His board of directors, frustrated by his newfound absence, demanded meetings. During one such conference call, his CFO said sharply, "You're losing focus, Ethan. We have shareholders to answer to." Ethan leaned back in his chair, staring at the skyline outside his window. "For once, I'm answering to something more important," he replied quietly. When the call ended, he didn't feel guilt. He felt free. But freedom had its cost. The company began to struggle under new competition, and one name kept resurfacing: Alexander Voss, his former mentor-turned-rival, a man known for his ruthlessness. Rumors spread that Voss was quietly buying out smaller firms tied to Reed Enterprises, undermining contracts, manipulating markets. When Ethan confronted him, Alexander simply smiled. "You're distracted, old friend," he said. "You used to know that emotions are the death of good business." Ethan stared at him, realizing how easily those words could have once come from his own mouth. "Maybe," he said. "But maybe business isn't everything." Voss's smile faltered for the first time. "We'll see how long you can afford to believe that." That night, Ethan returned home later than usual. The lights in the living room were still on, and Lily had fallen asleep on the couch surrounded by crayons and half-finished drawings. On the table was a picture of a tall man holding hands with a little girl, standing in front of a house with flowers in the yard. Above it, she had written, "Home." He picked up the drawing and felt something tighten in his chest. He realized that for her, home wasn't defined by walls or money, it was defined by presence, by trust. And in that moment, he understood what Emma had meant when she wrote that Lily deserved to know him. Not the man the world admired, but the man he had buried beneath ambition. He carried her to her bed, tucking her in carefully. As he stood there, watching her sleep, he whispered a promise to the quiet room. "I won't fail her like I failed you," he said, thinking of Emma. "I'll get it right this time." But even as he spoke, he knew the world wouldn't let him keep that promise easily. Over the next few weeks, the pressure mounted. The company's collapse loomed closer, and the board threatened to remove him as CEO. He spent his days fighting to keep everything from falling apart and his nights sitting by Lily's bedside, pretending everything was fine. One evening, she woke and found him there, his face buried in his hands. She reached out sleepily and touched his arm. "You can sleep here too," she murmured. "It's big enough for both of us." He laughed quietly, tears burning in his eyes, and lay down beside her, feeling the smallest hand in the world anchor him in a way no success ever had. In the morning, sunlight spilled across the room, and for the first time in years, he didn't dread the day ahead. He looked at her sleeping beside him and realized that no matter what happened with the company, no matter what he lost, he had already gained something greater. But fate, he knew, had a way of testing fragile peace. And as he got up to answer the phone ringing in the next room, he had no idea that the call he was about to take would unravel everything he had worked to rebuild. The call came early in the morning, just as the first rays of light were spilling through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse. Ethan had been standing in the kitchen, preparing breakfast for Lily, something that had slowly become their morning ritual. She was still asleep in her room, her favorite stuffed bear tucked under one arm. The phone on the counter began to ring, and he answered without thinking, expecting it to be one of his assistants or perhaps the school. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, cold, and clipped. "Mr. Reed, this is Detective Harris with the City Police Department. We need to speak with you regarding an incident involving your daughter's caregiver." For a moment, his mind went blank. The nanny he had hired just weeks ago had seemed professional, quiet, experienced. His pulse began to race. "What incident?" he asked, already feeling dread coil in his stomach. The detective paused before answering. "There was a break-in last night at your residence's parking level. We believe it wasn't random. The suspect escaped, but we have reason to think your family might have been the intended target." By the time he reached the security office in his building, the detective was waiting. On the monitor, grainy footage showed a man in a hooded jacket moving quickly through the garage, pausing near Ethan's car. The image was blurry, but something about the man's posture felt deliberate. The detective explained that the intruder hadn't stolen anything, he had simply left a note on the car's windshield. It contained a single sentence written in black marker: "You can't protect what isn't yours." The words hit him like a physical blow. He didn't need to guess who was behind it. Alexander Voss. The same man who had once called him a friend now wanted to destroy not only his company but his peace. He spent the rest of the day in a fog of fury and fear. He had security doubled, cameras installed in every corner of the building, and an unmarked car stationed outside. He tried to hide it from Lily, but she sensed the change immediately. That evening, as they sat together watching a children's movie, she turned to him and asked, "Why are there new men downstairs? They look like soldiers." He forced a smile. "Just helping keep us safe." She tilted her head, unconvinced. "From what?" He hesitated before answering. "From people who don't always like me." Her small hand reached for his, and she said simply, "Then I'll like you enough for both of us." It was such an innocent thing to say, but it nearly broke him. Over the following weeks, the tension grew unbearable. Anonymous emails flooded his inbox, threats disguised as business messages, offers to sell company secrets. His investors began to withdraw. The board called an emergency meeting, accusing him of negligence. Voss had been orchestrating everything, feeding stories to the media, framing Ethan as unstable, unfit to lead. When Ethan confronted him in person, meeting him in a quiet private club late at night, Voss only smiled. "You traded everything real for a fantasy, Reed," he said, sipping his drink. "You think love and redemption will save you? They'll destroy you faster than greed ever could." Ethan leaned forward, his voice cold and steady. "You're wrong. They already saved me." Voss laughed softly. "We'll see about that." That night, when Ethan came home, the penthouse was dark except for the faint glow of a nightlight in Lily's room. He went to check on her and froze. The window was open. The curtains moved softly with the breeze. His heart stopped. "Lily," he called, his voice tight. From the shadows, a small figure appeared. She was standing near the window, still awake, holding her stuffed bear. "I couldn't sleep," she said quietly. "I thought Mommy might be outside." Relief hit him so hard his knees almost gave out. He crossed the room and closed the window firmly, kneeling beside her. "You can't open that at night, sweetheart. It's not safe." She nodded solemnly, then looked at him with wide eyes. "Are bad people coming for us?" He wanted to lie, to tell her the world was perfectly safe, but something inside him refused to. "Not if I can help it," he said softly. The next day, he made a decision. He called his lawyer and began transferring control of Reed Enterprises to a trusted colleague. He didn't want Lily to grow up in a world built on power and enemies. "Sell it all," he told them. "I'm done." The lawyer tried to reason with him, but Ethan's tone left no room for argument. He would walk away from the empire he built if it meant giving Lily a chance at a normal life. When the sale became public, the media went into a frenzy. Headlines screamed about the billionaire's downfall, his instability, his mysterious disappearance from the corporate world. Ethan didn't care. He spent the day packing only the essentials: clothes, a few of Emma's paintings, and the crayon drawings Lily had made. That evening, he picked her up from school and drove out of the city without telling anyone where they were going. They ended up in a quiet coastal town several hours away, a place he had found years ago during a business trip but had never really seen. The sea air was sharp and clean, and for the first time in months, he could breathe without feeling watched. He rented a small house near the water, its white walls cracked and its porch creaking, but to Lily, it was perfect. "Can we stay here forever?" she asked as she ran barefoot through the sand. He smiled faintly. "Maybe for a while." She looked up at him, her eyes catching the sunset. "Then it's home." Days passed peacefully at first. They settled into a routine: morning walks on the beach, cooking simple meals together, reading stories before bed. But the peace didn't last. One night, as rain lashed against the windows, Ethan's phone buzzed with a message. It was a video. His heart clenched as he pressed play. The footage showed his old office, his nameplate ripped from the door, men tearing down the sign of Reed Enterprises. A text followed: "You can run, but you can't disappear." He deleted the message, but dread settled in his chest like a weight. He didn't tell Lily about the message, though she could sense something was wrong. She grew quieter, watching him carefully as he tried to pretend everything was fine. The next afternoon, while walking back from the grocery store, he noticed a black car parked near their house. It wasn't from the town, too polished, too deliberate. Panic surged through him. He took Lily's hand. "We're going inside," he said. Her small fingers tightened around his. When they reached the porch, the car engine started and slowly drove away, but the unease lingered. That night, he barely slept. In the morning, he made another choice, one that would change everything again. He called Detective Harris, the same officer who had contacted him weeks ago. "If something happens to me," he said quietly, "make sure the girl is safe. Her name is Lily Reed. She's all that matters." The detective hesitated. "Mr. Reed, what's going on?" But Ethan ended the call before he could answer. He looked out the window at the sea, its endless horizon stretching beyond the rain. For years, he had believed power meant control, but now he understood it meant protection. And he would protect Lily at any cost, even if it meant giving up the last pieces of the life he'd built. That evening, as thunder rolled over the ocean, Lily came to him with a drawing in her hand. It showed a man standing in front of a storm, holding the hand of a little girl. Above them, the words were written in careful block letters: "Together, we're safe." He felt tears burn his eyes as he pulled her close. Yes, he whispered into her hair. Together, we're safe. But deep down, he knew the storm outside wasn't the only one coming. The storm that had been gathering over the ocean finally broke 2 nights later. Rain battered the small coastal house, turning the windows into trembling mirrors of lightning. Ethan sat in the living room, the glow from the fireplace flickering across his face as he watched the storm roll in. He had been on edge for days, sleeping in intervals, listening for sounds that didn't belong. Every creak of the old house, every gust of wind made his pulse spike. He had never been a fearful man, but the thought of losing Lily filled him with a kind of dread he couldn't explain. She was asleep in the next room, her favorite stuffed bear tucked under her chin, her breathing steady and soft. He should have felt at peace watching her rest, but peace had become something he no longer trusted. When the power went out just after midnight, he knew it wasn't the storm. The lights flickered once, twice, and then the house went dark. He moved quickly, grabbing the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and checking the locks. Everything was still bolted shut, but the unease in his stomach deepened. Outside, the wind howled, carrying the sound of something metallic shifting, maybe a gate, maybe something else. He turned toward the window and froze. A car was parked down the road, its headlights off, its silhouette barely visible through the sheets of rain. He stood perfectly still, waiting for it to move, but it didn't. It just sat there, like a shadow waiting to breathe. He went to Lily's room and stood in the doorway for a long time. She was safe, for now. He couldn't risk waking her, couldn't risk frightening her unless he had to. But every instinct in him screamed that danger was close. He reached into the nightstand drawer where he kept a small revolver, an old weapon he'd never thought he'd use. He checked the chamber, the metallic click almost drowned by the sound of the storm, and waited. Minutes passed like hours. Finally, the sound came, the faint crunch of footsteps on wet gravel. Someone was outside. He turned off the flashlight and moved to the window, peering through the curtain. A figure moved slowly across the yard, tall, deliberate, carrying something long and thin that glinted faintly in the lightning. Ethan's mind raced. There was no one in town who knew who he really was, no one who should have reason to find him here. Which meant whoever this was had followed him from the city. He stepped silently across the floor toward Lily's room, but before he reached it, a crash shattered the silence, the sound of glass breaking in the kitchen. He didn't think. He moved. The adrenaline took over, sharp and cold. He darted into Lily's room, scooped her up before she even had time to wake fully, and whispered against her ear, "It's okay, baby. Don't make a sound." Her eyes opened in confusion, but she didn't speak. He grabbed a blanket and wrapped it around her small body, carrying her toward the back of the house where an old service door led to the dunes behind the property. As he reached the hallway, a voice called from the dark. "You can't hide forever, Reed." It was low and familiar, and it stopped him cold. Voss. Of course it was him. The man who had taken everything from him in the city had come to finish what he started. Ethan turned slowly, clutching Lily tighter, his pulse thundering. The outline of Alexander Voss stood near the broken window, his figure distorted by the flickering light of the storm. "You ran," Voss said, stepping closer. "You made me look weak. You think you can build yourself a new life and walk away clean?" Ethan's voice was low but steady. "You've already won. You got the company, the headlines, everything you wanted. Leave her out of this." Voss's smile was thin and cruel. "Oh, I don't care about the company anymore. I care about watching you lose the one thing money can't buy." Lily whimpered softly, and Ethan's grip tightened. He moved toward the back door, his mind calculating every second. The gun was still in his hand, heavy and ready. "You take one more step, and I'll stop you," he said quietly. Voss laughed. You won't. You're not that man anymore. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating both their faces for a single breathless moment, the predator and the man he'd hunted to ruin. But Voss was wrong. Ethan was still that man, and more. He pulled the trigger. The sound was deafening in the small house, a single explosion of light and noise that drowned out even the thunder. Voss staggered backward, shock spreading across his face as he fell. The silence that followed was suffocating. Ethan stood frozen, the gun trembling in his hand, Lily clinging to his shoulder. He felt no triumph, no relief, only an ache so deep it made his vision blur. He carried her outside into the rain, away from the broken glass and the lifeless figure on the floor. The storm swallowed them whole as they stumbled across the dunes, the wind tearing at their clothes, the sand cold beneath their feet. They reached a small boathouse near the edge of the beach, and he set her down, wiping the rain from her cheeks. "It's over," he said, his voice shaking. "You're safe now." She looked up at him, her eyes wide and afraid. "Are you hurt?" He shook his head. "No. But we can't stay here anymore." By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving the world eerily still. Police sirens echoed faintly in the distance as the local authorities arrived, responding to a neighbor's report of gunfire. Detective Harris was among them, his expression grim but not surprised. He listened quietly as Ethan explained everything, the threats, the company, the break-in, the confrontation. When he finished, the detective placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did what you had to do. But you can't stay here. The press will tear you apart once they find out." Ethan nodded, exhausted. "I don't care about me. Just make sure she's safe." They relocated to a temporary safe house under police supervision. It was small and plain, but it had sunlight and quiet, and Lily seemed content as long as he was near. She asked questions sometimes, about Voss, about why they had to leave the ocean, about whether they would ever go home. He told her the truth he could bear to share. "Home isn't a place," he said one night as she fell asleep beside him. "It's people. It's you." She smiled faintly and drifted into dreams. The following weeks blurred together in a haze of investigations, legal statements, and reporters trying to find them. The police ruled the shooting as self-defense, but the public loved a scandal. For a time, Ethan's name was everywhere again, not as a genius or a tycoon, but as a man who had fallen from grace. Yet he didn't care. Every morning, he woke to Lily's laughter and sunlight on the wall, and that was enough. One morning, months after the storm, they walked along a quiet country path near their new home. The air smelled of wildflowers, and Lily carried a small sketchbook in her hands. "I made something for you," she said shyly, handing it to him. On the first page was a drawing of a tall man holding hands with a little girl beneath a bright sun. Above them were the words, "My dad, my hero." He looked at her, overwhelmed. "Why am I your hero?" he asked softly. She shrugged. "Because you didn't let the bad people win. And because you always come back for me." He closed the book slowly, his throat too tight for words. That night, as he stood by her window watching the stars appear one by one, he realized that his life had been rebuilt from ashes, not with power or wealth, but with forgiveness and love. Emma's voice echoed in his memory, the words from her letter still carved into his heart. "If you ever decide to stop running, she deserves to know you." He finally had stopped running. And now, every time Lily reached for his hand, he knew he had been given the one thing he never thought he deserved, a second chance to be the man his daughter believed he already was. Months passed before the shadows of what had happened finally began to lift. The investigation ended quietly, the papers moved on to newer scandals, and the world forgot about the man who had once been one of its most powerful figures. Ethan didn't mind. Forgetting was a kind of mercy. He and Lily settled into a new life in the countryside, far from the noise of the city and the glass towers that had once defined him. Their new house sat on a hill surrounded by tall trees, with a narrow dirt road that led down to a small town. It was nothing like the penthouse he had lived in before, no marble floors, no security guards, no constant hum of electronics. The walls were uneven, the roof creaked when it rained, and the fireplace smoked if the wood was too damp. But for Lily, it was perfect. And for him, it was the first place that ever felt like home. Every morning, they would walk down the hill to a small cafe where the owner, a kind woman named Margaret, would greet them with hot chocolate for Lily and black coffee for Ethan. At first, people in town didn't recognize him, and when they did, they were too polite to ask questions. They saw a quiet man who kept mostly to himself and a little girl who loved to draw pictures of birds on napkins. Lily quickly became a favorite among the locals. She had a way of making everyone smile. Sometimes, as Ethan watched her laughing with the baker's wife or helping the librarian sort books, he wondered how someone who had seen so much loss could still shine so brightly. It humbled him. It also terrified him. He knew how fragile happiness could be. One evening in early autumn, as the leaves began to turn gold, he found her sitting on the porch with her sketchbook open on her knees. She was drawing a picture of the house, the trees, and the two of them sitting side by side. "I like it here," she said without looking up. "It feels like Mommy's watching us." The words made his chest tighten. He sat beside her, watching her small hands move with careful strokes. "Do you think she'd be proud of me?" he asked after a long pause. Lily stopped drawing and looked up at him with a seriousness far beyond her years. "She's already proud of you," she said. "Because you kept your promise." He frowned slightly. "What promise?" She smiled faintly. "To not be alone anymore." Her words stayed with him long after she went to bed. That night, as he sat by the fire reading through some papers, he found himself thinking about the woman he had been and the man he was now. He had walked away from everything, his company, his status, his old life, and yet, for the first time, he didn't feel like he'd lost anything that mattered. Still, there was something unfinished inside him, a quiet restlessness that whispered late at night. He knew he couldn't run forever. At some point, he would have to face what was left of his old world, not to reclaim it, but to close it properly. The opportunity came unexpectedly. One morning, he received a letter addressed to him from the city. It was from the board of Reed Enterprises, requesting his presence to finalize the dissolution of the company. They were breaking apart what was left, selling the remains to investors. The letter was formal, detached, but it stirred something inside him. He hadn't set foot in that building since the night everything fell apart. Lily noticed his expression as he read it. "Is it bad news?" she asked. He folded the paper slowly. "No," he said. "Just something I need to finish." She tilted her head. "Will you come back?" He smiled gently. "Always." A week later, he took the train into the city. It felt like stepping into another life. The skyline was the same, but it no longer looked magnificent. It looked distant, like a memory. When he entered the glass tower that once bore his name, the receptionist didn't recognize him at first. The lobby felt colder than he remembered, the air sterile, the walls covered with sleek digital screens advertising a company that no longer belonged to him. As he took the elevator up to the top floor, his reflection in the mirrored doors caught his attention. He looked older, calmer, and maybe, for the first time, truly human. The meeting was brief. Papers were signed, formalities were exchanged, and in less than an hour, Reed Enterprises was gone. The empire he had built over 15 years now existed only as ink on a document. But as he stood by the window afterward, Looking down at the city that had once been his kingdom, he felt no sorrow. Only peace. He realized that the buildings he had once thought represented his legacy were nothing compared to the laughter of one small girl waiting for him at home. Before leaving, he walked into his old office, which had been stripped of furniture and replaced with temporary desks. He stood in the center of the room where, once upon a time, a little girl had walked in and changed his life forever. He could still hear her voice, soft and trembling, saying, "I found you, Daddy." The memory hit him so hard that he had to close his eyes. It was in this very room that the man he used to be had begun to die, and the man he was meant to become had been born. He touched the windowpane lightly, then turned and walked away without looking back. When he returned home that evening, Lily ran out to meet him, her hair flying behind her, her face lit up with excitement. "You came back," she said, throwing her arms around his waist. He lifted her off the ground, laughing. "Of course I came back. I told you I would." She grinned up at him. "Then you kept your promise again." They spent the rest of the evening making dinner together, listening to music on the old radio, and watching the stars appear outside the window. Later that night, after Lily fell asleep, Ethan stepped outside onto the porch. The sky was clear, filled with constellations. He thought about Emma, about how much she had endured, and about the strange way life had brought him back to the very thing he'd once run from. He knew she would have wanted this for them, a quiet life, full of love, far from the chaos of ambition. For years he had believed that greatness was measured in wealth and influence, but now he understood it was measured in gentleness, in forgiveness, in the ability to build something out of broken pieces. The next morning, Lily woke him early, tugging at his arm. "Come on, Daddy," she said. "We have to go somewhere." He followed her sleepily as she led him down the hill to a field near the woods. She stopped beside a small tree she had planted weeks before. "I think it's growing," she said proudly. "I named it Mommy's tree." He knelt beside her, running his fingers through the soft soil. "She'd like that," he said quietly. Lily smiled. "Then it's for her. But it's for us too. Because trees don't leave, they just keep growing." He nodded, his throat tight. They stood there together in the morning sun, the wind carrying the scent of new leaves, the sound of birds echoing from the woods. It struck him then that life wasn't about erasing the past or outrunning it, it was about learning to live with it, to let it root into the ground and grow into something new. The man who had once lived in glass towers had finally found his foundation in the earth beneath his feet, in the small hand that fit perfectly inside his own, in the laughter that filled the spaces where silence used to live. For the first time, he didn't think about what he had lost. He thought about what he still had and what he could give. He looked down at Lily, her face turned toward the sky, her eyes bright and fearless, and knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The storms were behind them now, and though he knew life would never be perfect, it would be real. And that, after everything, was enough. Spring came slowly that year, washing the town in green and gold, softening the hard edges of everything that had once felt unmovable. By then, Ethan and Lily had built a rhythm to their days, a gentle, steady life that felt almost sacred in its simplicity. The mornings were filled with the sound of birds and the smell of fresh bread baking in the oven, and the evenings ended with stories told by firelight, the shadows dancing on the walls like old memories made kind again. The chaos of the past months had receded into something distant, almost unreal, as if it had happened to another version of himself. But some nights, when the wind moved through the trees just